entire Gospels. What's the basic message of the Scriptures? I love you. I'm committed to you. I swear that I will never forsake you. You are mine. I am yours. I am your Father, and you are my family. That's what we see throughout the Scriptures as salvation history rolls itself out. And it's interesting because I grew up in a Mexican household. My grandmother was very much a big part of my own journey. And I share this image because this was all over her house. And I put there, Jesus is watching you, because she used to tell us that every time this is the Sacred Heart picture, that no matter where you go, he's always following you, right? And when she would leave us alone in the room to play or whatever, she would close the door and says, Jesus is watching you, make sure you watch. And don't do anything stupid. Because Jesus is watching you. There was some key understandings. My grandmother grew up in the time of the late 20s in Tepatitlan. And if you know what happened in Tepatitlan in the Catholic Church in the late 20s, it was the Cristero War that was going on. And my great-grandfather used to hide the priest in his attic, in his hacienda. And they would celebrate weddings and baptisms in my grandmother's home because the churches were closed. So when I learned faith, I learned a lot from her. And I realized the way this is handed down is through us, to our children. Sadly, statistics are showing that our children aren't staying in the Catholic faith. Yet if they only knew the beauty of it, they would have no reason to run away. And the Eucharist is, I'll explain why. A few key understandings. I'm not going to go through all of these slides, but what we believe about the Eucharist, the authority of Jesus Christ, God having no time. What transubstantiation is basically biblical foundation for why we believe in the Eucharist. Catholic teaching about the Eucharist calls it the source and summit of the Christian life. And what I basically teach is if you pulled out the teaching of the Eucharist, that Jesus Christ is physically present in body, blood, soul, and divinity in a host, in a consecrated host, if you pull that teaching out, the entire Catholic faith falls apart. You can't hold it together. It's different from our Protestant brothers and sisters that believe that a symbol of Jesus is held in a wafer. It's not the same thing of what happens because of what Jesus does at the Last Supper. It changes when Jesus does the Last Supper. And so we have to look at who Jesus is, number one. We've got to understand why we believe what we believe. Who is Jesus? If he is God as he claimed him to be, how do we know? Because he spoke with authority. He makes claims. There's miracles that we see, and the resurrection is another claim. We see all these things happening in the Scriptures that point to us and reveal to us the reality of who God is in him as the second person of the Trinity. A couple of stories of authority that he talks about. Creation. If Jesus is the creator, creation obeys the creator. And you see stories of this. Jesus calms a storm. He goes out and says, be still. The waves and wind, they all stop. Why? Because he created it. The creation is made to create. The only exception to not having to follow the orders of the Creator is who? Us. Because we have free will. We don't have to follow the orders of the Creator. Another story. The cure of the demoniac. He cures the demoniac. A person with a demon says, be out, cast out. And at the very end it says, for with authority, they ask, for with authority and power, he commands its creatures to go out of these people. Why? Because that demon was created. Right? He curses the fig tree. He goes to pull off a fig off a fig tree, and the tree is dead. It doesn't give anything. So he curses it and it withers and dies. And they ask him, immediately the tree withered, and they start saying, who are you? So Jesus is revealing who he is to us, and leads us to the next point. And I'm sharing this with you because this is the foundation to understanding my experience with the Eucharist. God has no time. When Marianne asked me if I can do this, I said, I gotta check my calendar. I'm a pretty busy guy. I gotta see if I have the time. What I share by saying that is I'm limited by my schedule. I have a certain number of hours in the day. When I say God has no time, I don't mean that he doesn't have time for us. I mean that he doesn't exist in a time continuum. What does that mean? That means that he is timeless. That time marks the change in created things. 50 years ago, I was a baby. You see change 50 years later. What we have what's called chronos time in the Greek. Chronos meaning is from the root word of chronological, from beginning to end. God doesn't exist within a time continuum. He's always present. Versus what we call kairos time. If you've heard of things called the kairos retreat, is stepping out of chronos time and into kairos time. This is important for understanding what happens at the altar. Because if God doesn't exist in time, then that means what we're experiencing at the sacred liturgy is God stepping out of chronos time, and we are stepping into kairos time, into his time. Does that make sense? But that is always present. What does that mean? That means if God is always present, and everything always exists for God, that means a couple of things. Number one, he's experiencing the day we were born right now. At the same time, he's seeing us sitting in this church. If we're married and have kids, he's seeing our kids get married and have their own kids, and seeing our grandchildren born right now. He's seeing our ancestors centuries later being born right now at the same time that he's seeing us watching, sitting in this church. That's what I mean by God has no time. Right? That's important. And how do we know this? In his prayer right after the Last Supper, he prays. If you read the prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17, he says, now this is the eternal life, that they should know the only one true God, the one whom you sent, Jesus Christ. And then he says, closes it, Father, with you, with the glory that I had with you before the world began. That means he was present at the creation of the world. But we read in Genesis, Jesus was there. And it's interesting because when we read Genesis, we start seeing, let us make man in our image. Well, who's us and who's our? Because if it's only God, who's us and who's our? There's a Trinity there already. Even though the word Trinity doesn't exist in the scriptures. All right? I started researching this a little bit more. In 2019, came across this scientific article. A new theory on time indicates that present and future exist simultaneously. Blow your mind. If that's true, then what Jesus does at the Last Supper, here's the kicker. What he does at the Last Supper, as he's celebrating the Last Supper, giving us his body and his flesh, at the same time he's breaking bread, he's also being crucified. Because he's God, he doesn't exist in time. At the same time he's being crucified, he's also resurrected, which is what we call the Paschal mystery. So that's crucial for what we're entering into when we come to be fed off of the Lord's presence, by the Lord's presence and grace. And why would he do that? Why would he give us himself? Because he knows the only way he can transform our hearts is by getting inside of us. Right? Transubstantiation, what we believe something is and how the substance changes. I'm not going to go through all that. We've got limited time. But then we start looking at the biblical foundations. And I'm going to invite you, if you have a missal, there would be one right in front of you in your pews. If you turn to page 37, this is the gospel from, and we're not going to read all of it, believe me. But I'm going to set the story for you, because I think it's important to understand the story. This is the beginning of John chapter 6, where he's setting the story. And if you start reading, you said they went to the Sea of Galilee and all this stuff, and what they're referencing is the feeding of the 5,000. This is the first part of John's gospel, right? The first part is going to be fed. There's going to be a miracle. He takes a few fishes and a few loaves and creates enough that there's 12 wicker baskets left over. They're going to have a miracle that's going to feed everybody. So that's the first thing. If you look at the following Sunday, which is the very next Sunday after that, which will be page 39, you see how the story continues. Now, if you read the parallel gospel in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're going to see another story of Peter walking on water. They don't reference it specifically here, but we know that it happened because of how they reference the feeding of the 5,000, right? What happens when Peter walks on water? The Lord is walking towards the boat, the apostles are on, they see this image, they think it's a ghost. And what happens? They realize it's the Lord. He says, step out and come to me. Peter steps out. He keeps his eyes focused on Jesus. The wind starts picking up. He gets a little scared. And what happens? He begins to sink. He takes his eyes off of the Lord. And then Jesus pulls him up. What did Peter lose? Faith and trust. There is a miracle in the first part of John's Gospel that is going to require faith and trust. And then you finish off the following Sunday, if you look at the next page, the next Sunday after that, page 42, is when he gives us the bread of life discourse. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood will have life within them. This happens when you read it in that page 42, happens a year before the Last Supper. So, and if you read what happened, we just read this last Sunday, on page, where is it? Page 51. It's the only place in the Bible where people decided I can't follow this teaching, Lord, and they leave. And it's interesting because if you look at page 51, it says, this saying is hard, who can accept it? Does this shock you? And then when you get to verse 66, it says, this is where, as a result of this, many of his disciples returned to their former way of life and no longer accompanied him. They left because they couldn't accept the teaching. And that teaching comes in John chapter 6, verse 66. What numbers are those? Is that by accident? No, there's not an accident there. So those are the biblical foundations. Fast forward a year later, he celebrates the Last Supper and gives us his body. He comes among his people. And so when we start talking about what we come to do in Eucharistic adoration and why we believe this, it's created, it's his presence of him giving himself to us so that we can have firm knowledge and know by faith that he's never left us. He's never left us since the Last Supper. Our church teaches us that the Last Supper was the first. We celebrate two things. Number one is the consecration of the Eucharist, where he gives us the Eucharist, and the institution of the priesthood that continues the Eucharist today. Right? So, understanding all that, and I learned a lot of this from my grandmother, and then me studying it, but understanding all that, I get to start being a youth minister here. And the first thing that somebody says, you've got to bring them to the Eucharist. I actually did a Cursillo through this parish back in the 90s, and we used to have them in the old church. And I had a very profound encounter in adoration. So I understood, and all the things that my grandmother taught me as a kid about having that personal worship, I started to understand. And so when I became youth minister, you'll see a picture here of Rome. I got, as Marianne said, I got to take kids to World Youth Day in Paris and in Rome and in Toronto. I organized the one from in Cologne, Germany, but I couldn't go because we were getting married that year. My wife was going to have that. So adoration in Rome, it was 2 million people. If you can imagine what that looks like. And what I remember was thinking, I was going through my faith thinking at that point, what do these kids see? What happened was we were at a rally, they had this praise and worship music, and all of a sudden we were on the Spanish Steps and all these kids are all over me. Not of me, but I'm saying all around. And they bring out the monstrance. All these kids go down on their knees like, what is going on? I had never experienced, we never grew up with adoration here. At least not when I was a kid. So what is going on? What do they see that I don't? And the profound moment hit me when I could be in the midst of the Blessed Sacrament with all these people praying with me, but I still heard the ambulances and things going through the Roman streets. Those European sirens going through the Roman streets, and you're thinking, my God, he comes in the midst of our darkness, of our trials, and he comes for a purpose, right? And then I'm establishing this in all the schools that I went to. When I've served as the principal at Sarah, Father Sal had already started doing adoration for the kids. I said, can we change up the music a little bit just to get them more engaged? He said, sure, let's do it. Did it at Pies with Pies. Magic Mountain. We took kids to Magic Mountain. Six Flags Magic Mountain, you wouldn't expect to have adoration where there's roller coasters going everywhere. Jesus comes to meet us where we're at. And so, earlier this year, when the Eucharistic Revival was being announced and the Congress was going to take place in Indianapolis, Thunder called me and said, hey, is anybody going from Catholic schools? I said, well, no, not that I know of. I wasn't going. He said, well, we want to fund a coalition of Catholic school folks. Could you get it together? I said, the deadline's in a week. How am I supposed to get, they gave us a grant for $50,000. They said, get wherever you can to go. So I called up a bunch of school leaders that I thought might be interested. I said, can we, and so that's our delegation at the Indianapolis airport. 18 of us ended up going from Catholic schools, over 200 from the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. With this anticipation and excitement. And I'll tell you, I'm sharing with you the first night of adoration. It started with 50,000. It grew to 60,000 by the time we were done. By the time that the 4 or 5 days were over. And, you know, we got to celebrate Mass with Archbishop Gomez at their cathedral, just with the LA delegation. We went with all this anticipation of trying to understand and encounter the Lord in more profound ways. There was a lot of excitement as you were approaching it. Saw Father Mike Schmitz, you can't see the pictures, but a lot of great speakers. Profound moment for me. I had never been to one before. This is they had a Byzantine liturgy, and if you've ever been to a Byzantine liturgy, it had a whole different mysticism and transcendence to it. That was the bishop that celebrated it. It was incredible. And this was a moment. This was very profound. I don't know if you can see this, but there's an altar where the light is being fixated. And you can see the lights shining on it. But you see that strong beam of light that's coming right out? That's natural light that happened to make it to the altar the moment the monstrance was placed on the altar. And it was light coming from the windows on the other side of those seats. And I thought, my Lord, your presence is just incredible that would happen at the moment the monstrance makes it to the altar. Because they processioned the whole thing, and we were all like, what's going on? It's Jesus. He's really here. All right? And so I want to close with just we had the Eucharistic procession. And I can't describe that. All I can tell you is this. Going out and processing the Lord through the streets of Indianapolis, I can tell you every organization or business we visited, they said, we've never encountered anything like this. You guys are welcome to come back anytime. Yeah, bring Catholics in, and they're all excited, and there was no crime. There was no crime, apparently. But I'd like to share with you a little bit about what the procession was like, and then I'll close up with some of the words.